Have you ever really examined why certain feelings feel so familiar? Why we so often default to the same reactions, the same thoughts, the same emotional loops, without realizing we're doing it? I've been reflecting on this deeply and reading Joe Dispenza. He talks about a striking truth. By the time we reach our 30s, about 95% of who we are, our thoughts, behaviors, even our emotional reflexes, are no longer conscious. They're automated, embedded in the subconscious, running like a background operating system we rarely stop to question. But here's what's even more compelling. Over time, our bodies begin to memorize emotional states. Not just recognize them, but anticipate and recreate them, even before the mind consciously registers what's happening. This means that when something familiar occurs, an argument, a stressful trigger, a chance encounter, your body reacts before you can think. It floods you with the same emotions you've always associated with that scenario, and your brain complies, releasing the chemicals that reinforce that emotional state. It becomes a closed loop. Emotions fuel thoughts, which generate more emotions, which creates more thoughts, and so on. This feedback system is what gives rise to what's called the known future. You're not predicting what will happen. You're recreating it, emotionally and neurologically, based on the past. You're rehearsing the same experiences, the same outcomes, because that's what your biology is wired to expect. So we live in this illusion of movement, this surface-level variation in our daily lives. But internally, we're static, operating on scripts we didn't choose consciously, and yet follow with unwavering loyalty. But awareness changes that. I started to notice this in myself, the way I'd radiate during certain conversations or feel anxious in familiar spaces, not because of what was happening, but because my body had already decided how I should feel. And that's when I realized change doesn't start by waiting for a different life. It begins when you stop being the same participant in the life you already have. Recognizing the loop is one thing. Breaking it, living differently, is something else entirely. It doesn't require a dramatic gesture. No radical overhaul. Just the quiet discipline of noticing. Noticing that moment, however fleeting, where you're about to react, where your body starts to tense, where your thoughts begin to race down that familiar path. That's the entry point. That's where the opportunity lives. For me, it began with something small. Pausing. Not resisting the feeling, not denying the pattern, but interrupting it. I'd catch myself in the middle of a response that felt predictable, scripted, and I'd ask, what if I didn't react this way today? Not forever, just for now. What if I think of my response rather than blurt out what unconsciously comes to mind? At first, it felt awkward, artificial, like I was forcing something. But over time, that pause became more and more noticeable. And in that space, something new began to emerge. Not just a different response, but a different identity. A self that wasn't constantly bound to its history. A self capable of creating, not just repeating. Because that's what we forget. Familiarity isn't the same as truth. Just because something feels known, comfortable, or even painful in a recognizable way, doesn't mean it's who we are. Often it's just who we've been. And growth begins when we're willing to act as if that familiarity isn't a prison, but a signal, a chance to do it differently. Neuroscience backs this up. Every time you choose a new thought, a new behavior, you begin weakening the old neural connections and strengthening the new ones. Repetition creates wiring. Awareness creates change. That's not spiritual poetry. It's biological fact. So when I find myself drifting into the known future, I remind myself, the future is not a place I arrive at. It's something I build, choice by choice, thought by thought. And every unfamiliar decision I make is a vote for the person I'm becoming, not the one I've been rehearsing. So much of our identity, what we call ourselves, is made up of patterns. Not just behaviors, but expectations. We wake up, go through the motions, and anticipate the same types of feelings, thoughts, outcomes. And if we're not careful, we begin to mistake that predictability for who we really are. But what if that identity isn't fixed? What if it's just a snapshot of who we've been under certain conditions, repeating certain thoughts, surrounded by certain people? And if that's the case, what happens when we disrupt those conditions? When I began consciously interrupting my habits, Not with aggression, not with judgment, but with curiosity, I started to feel it. That edge. The edge of the known. It's subtle at first, like stepping out into unfamiliar weather. But it sharpens you. It reminds you you're alive. You start to see yourself differently. Not just as a product of memory or emotion, but as an agent of change. You're not just reacting anymore. You're responding. You're choosing. And that shift, that inner movement toward awareness, feels like power. Real power. Not control over others, or even mastery over every situation, but the power to decide how you show up, who you want to be, not once, but repeatedly, deliberately. It's humbling, honestly, because when you stop letting the old patterns steer, you're left with the question, then who am I? And for a while, the answer might feel like silence, like standing in a room that used to be full of noise and suddenly realizing it's quiet. But in that quiet, something will start to emerge. Not a new version of your old self. Not a better version even, just a more honest one. One that's not linked to the same emotional reflexes. One that's open to what this moment, this life, might actually become if you stop trying to predict it and instead start participating in it. If there's one thing I've learned through this process, it's that change isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. More often, it whispers. It shows up in the space between stimulus and response. In the breath you take before speaking. In the moment you catch yourself, just before slipping into the old way of reacting, and you choose something new. That's the work. Not transforming overnight, but showing up for yourself again and again, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. And some days, you'll miss it. You'll catch yourself halfway through an old reaction, maybe even all the way through. That's okay, that's part of it. Growth doesn't mean never falling into patterns. It means recognizing them faster and cutting yourself enough slack to try again. There's no finish line. No final version of you waiting with a gold medal. Just this moment, this breath, this choice. And when you think of it that way, when you stop chasing some ideal and instead let each day be its own opportunity, it becomes less about fixing yourself and more about uncovering who you were before the patterns took hold. Because deep down, beneath all the loops and habits, there's still that spark, that quiet presence that's never been defined by your past. It's just waiting for you to notice. So maybe the question isn't, how do I become someone else? Maybe it's, how do I become more present to who I've always been? That's where real change begins. Not in becoming perfect, but in becoming aware, and in mastering that awareness so we can shape the life we choose to live. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more discussions on consciousness, reality, and the mysteries of existence. Leave your thoughts in the comments below.